Okay, hello everyone. It looks like we're live now on YouTube. So welcome to tonight's meeting of the Local Development Plan Advisory Committee, and we're going to be discussing housing this evening. And we've got three presentations to hear, and I hope we'll have a good discussion. Before that, let's go through the preliminary parts of the meeting. Okay, sorry, I was just having a bit of a trouble finding the agenda on my computer there. Okay, I've got it now. So first of all, apologies for absence and substitutions. I believe we've had an apology for absence from Councillor Woodruff. Are there any other apologies or substitutions?
No, so it's just Councillor Woodruff, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Okay, well, I haven't been advised of any urgent matters, so I don't believe we've got any of those. Declarations of interest. Do any members have any declarations of interest that they feel they should make? If not, okay, I can't see anything. So matters to be considered in private. Well, again, I've not been notified of any of those, so I don't believe there are any. Okay, let's move on to minutes of the last meeting. I did have a point raised regarding the last minutes, by Will French, who's a member of the public, and I believe he's copied members of the committee in on that. So I have corresponded with Mr. French and sort of informed him that that we'll deal with the points he wants to raise as part of the update on the local development plan. So if everyone is agreed with that, we'll do that. Apart from that, does anyone have any points to raise on the minutes of the last meeting? Okay, if no one has any points they want to raise, are people agreed that we can approve those minutes?
Agreed, Chair.
Okay, well that's I think Councillor Mahmood is speaking. If Councillor Mahmood is speaking for the whole committee then we'll approve those minutes.
Agreed as well.
Okay, thanks very much, everyone. Okay, so moving on to the agenda then. So the local development plan update. So perhaps Steve, if before we move on to the speakers, you can give us a brief update on the status of the work on the local development plan.
Yes, more than happy to. Thank you very much, and good evening, everybody. So just to report, obviously it's been a pretty busy period this last month as we obviously continue the task of compiling our complex and compendious evidence base for the local plan. That's the stage that we're at the moment. I can confirm that the local development scheme, which is the public project plan setting out the timetable for future consultation and the various stages in plan making, will be published towards the end of next week. With regards to the statement of community involvement, which is a statement by the council which shows how in relation to plan making and also the dealing of planning applications and planning enforcement, which hasn't been updated for more than 5 years, that a draft has been prepared. It's actually with the portfolio holder for Good Growth, Councillor Manro, for review at the moment, and subject to any further comments or feedback from him, but we'll be aiming to publish that very shortly. In terms of the AMR. As you know, the interim AMR, which includes quite a lot of data on housing, was published last year. We have had some technical issues in relation to compiling an up-to-date 5-year land supply and a housing trajectory, and I plan to update in more detail on where we've got to on that work in relation to housing supply later on in tonight's meeting. In terms of the evidence base, I think it was Councillor Burke who raises the last meeting, and I have, thanks to helpful comments, reviewed the content on the web pages and the navigation, and I'm pleased to report that all of those pages have now been fully updated, including all of the evidence-based reports for the emerging new local plan. So those are all up to date now. And again, just to assist members of the committee, one of my colleagues has posted a very helpful link in the chat. There is a third edition of our new local plans newsletter going out. It was supposed to go out today, but I haven't actually seen it yet. It's being fielded by my colleagues in the press team. So if it doesn't go out tonight, it will certainly go out tomorrow morning. And that will also include the link to that page and indeed other important information. I should just say, in relation to the evidence base, of course, we are still obviously compiling what is a very extensive range of reports, and in some cases updating work that was done pre-pandemic. And indeed, part of tonight's report deals with some of those aspects. So the evidence base is far from complete, but certainly those reports which are ready and have been published are now all available on the council's web pages. If anyone has any problems or difficulties with that, please let me know personally and I will look into it. But I checked as of yesterday, all the links were working perfectly. Members will be aware that since November, we've been doing some fairly ambitious work through our new digital engagement platform around shaping Ealing. And I can report, as of moments ago, we have had so far 9,201 completed surveys sent back. So bearing in mind that the closing date now for the survey we've decided will be the 18th of March to predate obviously the pre-election period, which I think begins the following week. I think we're well on course for reaching in excess of 10,000 responses, which I have to say, from a personal and professional point of view, has surpassed my very high expectations in terms of what we would achieve for that. So we obviously will be compiling detailed analysis and a report summarising the issues that have been raised and the findings. We'll be aiming to publish that as soon as we can after the closure of the survey. You should also be aware there is a range of other public and stakeholder consultation events currently live, which are relevant to the local plan, and these relate to our review of conservation area appraisals and management plans, and this builds on a quite considerable period of informal consultation, particularly with the conservation area panels and some of the local community interest groups. So we're now doing a formal consultation, which will also close on March the 18th. So I would encourage people who have an interest in that to have a look at that. We've obviously reviewed and updated the appraisals and management plans. We've made some recommendations at this stage for changes of boundaries, and indeed even taken on an excellent suggestion for a new conservation area in Northfields. And again, once that consultation closes, we shall obviously prepare a report of the representations received, and that will then be presented to members to decide on what the next steps will be. And if it is decided that we will take forward any amendments to boundaries or new proposals, they will also be taken forward as part of the summer consultation. I think it's just also worth drawing members' attention to two other excellent pieces of work being done by colleagues elsewhere in the council. So I'm not claiming any credit for this at all, but which I think are very relevant to the work that we do in local plans. There are currently consultations underway on air quality, and particularly for relevance for tonight, a survey being done on housing strategy. And again, I've put a link in the chat for you to access the survey, and I would encourage people to have a look at that. There was also consultations in relation to a very technical report, which is a scoping report for the integrated impact assessment, which you'll remember we considered as a topic a couple of meetings ago. And we've also undertaken a very early call for sites. This will be an exercise that we will repeat again in the summer, but we thought it would be helpful to get ideas or suggestions for sites that might be included in the draft site allocations in the summer. We remain on course, finally, to undertake public and stakeholder consultation on draft initial proposals for the local plan in the summer. And more details of that will be outlined in the public project plan, which we publish next week. So I thought that's a very brief update. Obviously, I know the main topic today is housing, so I think we're all keen to get on to that. But if there's any questions, happy to field them.
Okay, thanks, Steve. If anyone does have any questions for Steve, can they raise their either a virtual hand or a real hand, or attract my attention in some way? Okay. Will, do you want to ask a question? Okay, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Collin. I think you said this was the point you would let me have a few words. That's right? Is it?
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah.
So please sort of ask your question. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Just a couple of points, if I may. First is, you said you didn't want my previous contributions included in the minutes. And I want to say I actually find that a bit disappointing, because I think it is important to keep a record of what this committee is doing. I know you say you're looking at changing the protocol for the committee. I'm not actually familiar with the protocol, but I did understand that it was designed to enable both members and members of the public to keep up to date with what's going on. And I have been making a few points about the overall presentation of documents which are key to the local plan making. And I think my comments merit being included in minutes, because they will come up when this gets to examination. And obviously I will be keeping records. And I think it's unfortunate if they're not kept by the committee. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second is that I'm really pleased and I'm grateful to Steve that some of these documents that I've been asking for quite a long time are now appearing. I note that they're going, I think, to Councillor Munro for his sign-off, which is good news. And then they become documents of the council. And I think that's important, that it's the council who's doing this. There's just a few points I would like just to make. Is the AMR, the monitoring review, it is still, people are still waiting for it. It goes back for 5 years. There has been an interim review, which has been welcome, but that interim review doesn't really focus on many of the key issues that the government guidance says should be in the AMR, and we're still looking for an update on it. So looking forward to that very much. The other area that I'm very interested in is the survey that's being done. It's very encouraging. We got so many people looking at it, and it will be very helpful to know how that's going to be analysed and reported on. I did the survey. I felt that it wasn't that easy to actually make my comments about what are the priorities and where the areas we should be addressing in this borough as part of the local plan. So it would be helpful to have a bit of feedback on there. I know you want me to keep it brief, Mr. Chairman, so I will stop there, but it would be useful to have a few comments back in response to what I say. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Will. Well, first of all, I'll just hand over to Steve to answer sort of the points you've raised there, and then before we move on, I'll respond on the issues around the protocol, if that's okay. So over to you first, then Steve.
I think there were 2 points. I mean, in relation to the AMR, we're going to come on to those issues.
Steve, are you?
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Steve.
Sorry. Okay. Right. Yeah. So I think there were 2 points there that were really for me to answer. On the AMR, we'll address that in the meat of the meeting, because we're going to talk about housing supply in a moment, which is entirely relevant. But I take on board the point that Will makes, which is, of course, what he's waiting to see is a fully published and detailed housing trajectory in the 5-year land supply. So we'll come on to where we've got to on that later in the meeting. On the point about the Shaping Ealing survey, clearly, obviously, we've surpassed our expectations, as I indicated before. So our task in terms of analysis is far greater. Obviously, where we have quantitative data, in other words, where people have indicated broad satisfaction or dissatisfaction with various attributes, that's relatively straightforward. And we will be providing compendious information. And we'll be trying to provide a breakdown by geographies, and by differing monitoring data categories where people have filled in that additional information. Clearly, obviously, the vast number of responses received means that the free-form text is obviously more challenging, and we are actually going to be providing a very detailed report looking at the issues that have been raised, summarising some of those. I can give you some of the flavours of those. I mean, some people, for example, very concerned about tall buildings and density. That isn't perhaps a great shock or surprise to many on the committee, perhaps. Others equally very, very concerned about the lack of genuine affordable housing on offer in the borough, and struggling to find suitable places to rent and to buy. On the other hand, though, very encouraging news, very positive reaction in terms of Ealing being a good place to live, about the levels of social inclusion, and diversity within the borough being generally strongly appreciated as being, strong reasons for attraction to the area. Similarly, the same thing could be said about, heritage and about green spaces. So, I mean, I'm not going to get into the detail, because that, I'm sure, will be a subject for a future meeting. And I note there is a separate scrutiny panel which is reviewing how we consult as a council. The local plan, I noticed, was one of the topics for consideration. Unfortunately, we won't have the report of the findings of the survey in time for that panel, which I think is on March the 17th. But we will, as always, we will publish that report, and we will certainly alert people through the newsletter and other mechanisms to the report's existence. And I'd be happy to have a future meeting to discuss some of the findings with Will or any of his other colleagues, if he would so wish.
Okay, thanks, Sir Steve. Just on the question of the public participation, as Will mentioned, there is a protocol for public contributions to this committee that was agreed by the committee quite a while ago. I think it was, two or more years ago now. That the provisions of it are basically that members of the public can contribute, but strictly to follow the protocol, they should notify Democratic Services at least 2 working days in advance, and they should provide notice of what the issue is they want to raise. So if that is followed, then they can be slotted into the appropriate place on the agenda, given a 3-minute speaking slot, which is what is provided for in the protocol, and that can all be sort of form part of the official business of the committee and be recorded in the minutes and so on. So now I have been fairly flexible in allowing public participation, and haven't strictly kept to the letter of the protocol. But I think it is best if at the next meeting and at meetings in future, if we do try and stick to the protocol as closely as we can, because that I think best ensures the smooth running of the meetings. What I will do, because I think it is a good point, that it's not very clear where that protocol is now. It's quite difficult to find on the council website. So I will discuss with council officers afterwards, what we can do about digging that protocol up and putting it somewhere where it is clearly accessible. And I will send a copy of it to Will anyway for his reference, so that he does know what it is in future. So that's it about the protocol. So unless there's any more points, okay, very quickly then, Will, if you do want to say something on that.
Many thanks. I will be quick. Just two things, really. You didn't mention why my previous contribution hadn't been minuted, because I do think that's useful. It really would be useful, and I think they should be. They merit being minuted. But I also would just like to say, with the note, I was late getting my request in today, and for that I apologise. Problem is, it's hard to keep up with it, and my request to Katie or somebody is actually to be notified when the agenda goes up, so that we don't make mistakes again. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Will. Okay, well, I mean, I don't think there was any particular reason why your comments weren't noted, but I think it's just a question that, that the minutes are a summary of the meeting. We don't, normally record every sort of question and every comment that was made. And in the, you had your points at the last meeting. I can't remember them in detail, but you were following up on points that you had raised at the previous meeting when you'd had a little presentation, and I think that was recorded in the minutes, and your comments were captured. So we have got a record that is minuted of your concerns, and I think the issues that you raised in them are being touched upon in the updates that we are sort of getting, like the one we had from Steve. I think if it's agreeable to the committee, we can make sure that the summary of Steve's update is recorded in the minutes, with the status of each of the the documents and deliverables that you mentioned, just so that there is a summary of that's on the public record. Is that okay to the committee and everyone? Okay, I assume that silence means assent in this particular case, so we will record that. Okay, well, if that's all on Steve's update, we'll move on to the main business of the meeting, which is the discussion on housing. As with the previous meeting that we had, I'd like councillors to, after each presentation, just to ask questions that relate to questions of clarification, or something that's very specific to that particular presentation, and then we'll save more general sort of comments or wider ranging questions to the end of the meeting, when we'll have the three presenters will get together as a sort of panel, and we can have a discussion with all of the presenters being able to contribute. So if people are okay with that, that's the basis on which we'll proceed. So the first speaker is Nigel Moore, and I believe Nigel works for Opinion Research Services, and he's going to tell us about the strategic market assessment. So over to you then, Nigel, if you could just introduce yourself and then give your presentation, please.
Hello, thank you for inviting me tonight. I'm Nigel Moore. I am Head of Housing Assessments at Opinion Research Services. I've been working in this field for about 17 years now. The company has been doing housing assessments for about 30 years. I've worked for almost every borough in London. I've worked several times in the past for Ealing, as we're going to discuss today. So what we're just going to be doing today is explaining what we will be doing for Ealing. We're part way through the work and therefore we don't have final outputs to share with you. So instead, we're just going to explain the process and what we're thinking about and what we're looking to get out of this study. So I'm going to share a screen. My understanding, as just explained, is that I'll give the presentation. Any questions will happen at the end. So I'm just going to share the screen for now. And hopefully this will all be visible for you all to see.
Yes, I can see that. Yep.
The one problem I've managed to give myself here, inevitably, is that I want to put this on slideshow, and there we are. It was the Zoom meeting itself was blocking out my access to the slideshow. So we're here to talk to you about a local housing needs assessment update for Ealing, and in particular, we're going to cover the issue of the overall housing need for Ealing and also affordable housing. So as a bit of background to this assessment, in 2016, we undertook work for all of the West London boroughs, that's Barnet, Brent, Ealing, Hammersmith and Fulham, Harrow, Hillingdon, Hounslow, and the Development Corporation at Old Oak and Park Royal were also involved in the study. This was published in 2018 as the West London Strategic Housing Market Assessment. The update that we're currently undertaking at the moment is for Ealing and Harrow, so only 2 of the 8 authorities that were involved in the last study. But any data and any discussion in this particular presentation only relates to Ealing, so we're not going to be covering anything relating to Harrow. And the key focus is really the overall housing need for Ealing and also the affordable housing needs of Ealing. So the first thing to consider is Ealing's role within the London Plan and also Ealing's role within national policy. So the first thing to consider is that in 2017, the government introduced a standard method for considering housing need and how a local authority would work out its housing need. So to do this for any local authority, you take the household projections which were produced by the then Department of Communities and Local Government and were 2014 based. And you look at the household projections between 2021 and 2031, so a 10-year period, and you average the growth of that. You then apply an uplift based on the ratio of house prices to incomes within the area. This is capped technically at 40% above the existing local plan target, but the uncapped figure for Ealing is 66.6%. You then further uplift this after an introduction which came in I think 2020, which was that all major cities in England should have a 35% further uplift to their number. And by major cities, this included all London boroughs. So effectively, you're taking the household projections, the growth from 2021 to 31, uplifting this by 66% in uncapped data, or 40% if it was going to be capped, then further uplifted by another 35% on top of that number. What that gives you for Ealing at the moment is an uncapped figure of 3,156 dwellings per annum. So the national policy is saying that is what the requirement for Ealing is.
Nigel, sorry to interrupt, but your
Yes.
slides are not scrolling forward, so you might just want to check that. Sorry to interrupt.
Is it currently saying government prescribed method can be summarised as?
No, you're on your cover page at the moment, I'm afraid.
Oh, okay.
Yes, that's true. Yeah, I was wondering
sorry.
about that, to be honest. Yeah.
It's scrolling forward for me. So this is not doing anything at all for you.
No, it's
Okay.
it's still on the front page.
I will come out of slideshow and see if it works better if we do it as a non-slideshow. I'm still sharing with you. So is this now showing the document called background?
It is, yes. Yes.
That's going through for you. Okay, it looks like
Yeah.
I'm going to have to, I'm afraid, just leave it off slideshow then. So I was actually on the false slide there. Apologise, I don't know why that did that. I just set it up as a slideshow just to run through, but we'll just have to do it without the slideshow. So yeah, as I was saying, the current local housing needs figure for Ealing is 3,156 per annum. So that's the number of dwellings you'd be expected to provide in line with national policy. But in London, these figures have very little weight because the recently adopted London plan has a significant role in allocating housing across London as a whole. So effectively, the individual borough figures in London count for very little. What I would also note is that the whole methodology is scheduled for an update imminently within the next few months is the expectation, and this will significantly impact upon the way in which figures are calculated. Therefore, I'm not assuming that much weight will be given to the 3,156 number for Ealing. Instead, a number which tends to be given much more consideration with London is the impact of the London Plan 2021. So within the London Plan, recently adopted last year, the identified need for housing in London as a whole amounted to nearly 66,000 dwellings per annum. And around 43,000 of these were to be affordable. So approximately two-thirds of the entire need was overall need was assessed as being affordable. However, the London Plan concluded that the level of housing capacity between 2019 and 2029 amounted to 52,870 dwellings per annum. And it was that number which was taken forward. So while the need was identified as 66,000, the actual level of delivery assumed going forward is less than 53,000. And there is no replacement anywhere as to where those 13,000 is going to go. It's not assumed to go anywhere else. It was just left unexplained. Further significance to this is that the average delivery in the past 3 years in London has actually been less than 37,000 dwellings per annum. So while the target may be to hit 53,000 or so dwellings, that has not been hit. And while conducting the assessment of the whole of London's capacity, they also looked at every individual London borough and the development corporations. So Ealing's share of London's capacity was assumed to be 2,157 dwellings per annum. And that is for the area outside of Old Oak and Park Royal. The need for Old Oak and Park Royal in total, which not only obviously covers Ealing, but covers the other boroughs connected to it, is 1,367 dwellings per annum. So there is still a very, very significant assumption that Ealing and Old Oak will deliver a tremendous amount of dwellings over the next 10 years and going forward beyond that point. What we would note is that the London Plan figures are not based on need. They are very much a capacity target. They've assessed what they think the amount of land available is and then distribute the need to where the sites are. So for our study, our starting point is to assess initially what are the needs of Ealing as a whole based upon its existing population and housing needs. So this is in no way constrained to either the standard method set by national government in policy, the 3,156, or the London capacity targets. So we're saying if Ealing keeps growing and keeps behaving the way it is from a population and household point of view, how many houses is it going to need? So we're effectively assessing Ealing as a standalone borough, but we're also going to model the needs on the basis of meeting the GLA's capacity figures, because many boroughs, when adopting the local plan, go ahead and just accept the GLA capacity figure. So we recently finished a study for Haringey, London Borough of Haringey, and they have essentially within that study just accepted that they're going to try and meet the capacity figures. What we'll also be looking at in terms of capacity target is the area of Ealing inside of the Old Oak and Park Royal Development Corporation and also the area outside of it. And again, when it comes to affordable housing needs, we'll be looking at both what are the localized housing needs for Ealing, and also what would happen if Ealing was meeting part of the wider needs of London, and how do these two things interact with each other. So we're looking at Ealing as a standalone borough and Ealing as part of a wider concept of London. And it's a very similar story on affordable housing. So we'll be looking at both those figures. We're going to look at local needs and capacity. We're going to consider both the current need for affordable housing. So this is people who need to move either within the affordable housing sector now or from the private sector into affordable housing. But we will also be considering future housing need from any new households who will be forming within Ealing or moving to the area. What we'll also be doing is considering those households who can afford their own private rents but may wish to own. This is a policy addition which happened to the National Planning Policy Framework in 2019. Therefore, it wasn't considered in the West London SHMA 2018. But the net diagram on the next page highlights what the issue is. For someone like myself, who's been doing these assessments, as I said in the introduction, for 17 years, the way we used to think about affordable housing need was we took all households and we said, can you afford market rents or can you not afford market rents? And if you couldn't afford market rents, you needed affordable housing. And that's the bottom line on this chart that I've just put up. The 2019 addition to the National Planning Policy Framework created another category which says, can you afford market rent? Do you want to own? Can you afford to own? And if the answer to that question is no, then you may need affordable home ownership. So it brings in a completely separate category into this compared to previous studies. And in turn, this has been matched by a number of policy initiatives, including First Homes, which we're scheduled to get a presentation on shortly after I'm finished here. So we're going to be considering both of these categories, people who can't afford to rent and people who can afford to rent but want to own and can't afford to own. So in terms of modelling affordable housing need in London, it's much different to trying to do this anywhere else in England because the range of products is different. The key products we're typically seeing in London are London social rent and London living rents. And London living rents are set at 1/3 of the median salary in the local area. But what we also get are shared ownership schemes still exist as well, where you're buying part of the property and renting on the remaining share. London living rents are typically assumed to be rented for 5 years, but there is then a presumption that the household will try to purchase the property. So within the definitions, this has been counted as affordable home ownership. However, the government have recently introduced a much wider set of products for affordable home ownership, the most prominent of which is First Homes. So not to try and steal the thunder of the presentation that's coming later, I will quickly just skip through this point, but so First Homes are sold with either 30, 40 or 50% discount on market prices. In London, they cannot sell for more than £420,000 and cannot be sold to anyone with a household income over £90,000. And that tends to lead us on to a discussion when we start looking at this in London and one which was alluded to in the introductions, I know, is how affordable is affordable housing? So London social rent, which is basically the replacement for old social rent, is typically across London assumed to meet the needs of households with incomes of up to £40,000. London living rent is often typically targeted at households of £40,000 to £60,000. First Homes and shared ownership products tend to be targeted at much higher household incomes. They can go up to £90,000. Many of the people within our model who we are assuming are going to be taking up First Home, for example, are often in the range of £60,000 to £90,000. So there is a suite of affordable housing products out there, ranging from those targeting relatively low income households to those who are targeting the households with around £90,000. there are big issues as to how you try and set this as a policy and how you think about the need. So in summary, what we're going to be looking at are those who can afford, who cannot afford market rent, and those who can afford market rent but aspire to own. And we'll be looking at the income ranges and assumptions around each of the affordable housing products. And ultimately, as part of a local plan, it typically comes down to that the level of need in total is probably too high for you to meet. And relative priority of need and viability of delivering affordable housing become very important. So while it is possible, for example, to deliver first homes, they're targeted at a completely different segment of the population than those targeting London living rent or London social rent, for example. So it is very much a policy choice that you will face in terms of how to implement this. So that's the end of my presentation. So I'm just going to stop sharing the screen and allow anyone to ask questions who has anything to say.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Nigel. Right. Well, does anyone have any points to clarify anything on that, or that's specific to that presentation that they like to raise at this point? As I say, there'll be an opportunity for people to raise points at the end of the meeting when we've had all three presentations. So, Councillor Shaw, is that because you want to ask a question? That you?
It is, yes, please,
Okay.
Chair.
Okay, go ahead, Councillor Shaw.
Thanks for that, Nigel. That was very, very interesting and helpful. I was just wondering, in terms of the definitions, just to understand, where you're talking about people who are renting but want to own a home, how was that established? I assume, was it just a tick box that, do you want to own a home? Is it an aspiration or a dream? Obviously home ownership in the UK is very prevalent, but internationally, perhaps in other countries, there are a lot lower rates of home ownership. So I was just wondering, the sort of weighting that was put on that.
Yes, approximately 50% of people who rent privately, if you ask them, will say that they want to own a home. And that in an area like Ealing is a frightening number to be trying to deliver if you're trying to deliver this product. But then the question becomes, how credible is that aspiration? So we model this against household income. So your household income must be high enough that you could get a mortgage. It must be inside of the overall cap for the product. You must also have savings. So there's no point in saying you want to own a home if you can't put down a 5-10% deposit on the property. And again, if we're talking about a £500,000 property as a new build, which is then discounted by 50% to £250,000, you're still looking at £12,500 minimum deposit before you do anything else. So you need significant savings just to be able to think about this. So by the time we've finished and we've filtered out everyone who is going to achieve home ownership on their own right, whose incomes are too high, whose incomes are too low, those who don't have savings, the numbers tend to come down to being something relatively small. For the London boroughs we've run this for, it's been in the low thousands over 20 years. It sounds a lot when we say low thousands, but we are really then talking about 100, 150 dwellings a year in the context of a few thousand total dwelling need. So the numbers do come down dramatically in terms of who qualifies and who is this a genuine aspiration and who has a realistic prospect of implementing that aspiration.
Yeah, thanks. That really explains it quite clearly, and you included some of the follow-ups that I might have had there. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, thanks, Nigel. Anyone else got a question quickly before we move on? Okay, I can't see any questions, so if anyone has got one, please shout out. If not, okay, no one's shouting out. So, okay, on to Steve Barton for the next presentation. Over to you, Steve.
Okay, can you see that now, please?
Yes, yes, I can see that.
Excellent, thanks very much. I'm going to provide a brief overview then of housing supply. So Nigel's already talked about the importance of the London Plan that was published last year. And the key figure there is the 2,157 net units per annum. That is the housing supply target for Ealing, and that's an annualized target based over a 10-year period from 2019-20 to 2028-29. The London Plan also sets an indicative target for small sites. These are sites that are regarded as being below 0.25 hectares in size. And that gives you a contribution of 424 units per annum. But that 424 units is included in the 2157 figure. I would just say at this point that there was intense debate during the examination of the London Plan about the small sites target. And indeed, the original targets that were being set in the draft London Plan would have given Ealing an overall housing delivery target of in excess of 2,800 net additional homes or units per annum. And Ealing, alongside neighbours in West London, and indeed with concerns voiced from other parts of London, particularly in the suburban areas, were very concerned about the deliverability of those targets. And indeed, based on the evidence and reports that we produced, and you may remember, Chair, we shared some of those reports and some of those findings in a previous cycle of LDAP meetings. The independent examiner agreed with us, and indeed the target for Ealing and indeed many other West London authorities was dramatically reduced, as I say, from around 2,800 to 2,157. Now, the reason why both Nigel and myself have talked about the London Plan is, and it's a point that I make at all of these meetings, but I'll make it again at the risk of repetition. The London Plan is an integral part of our local development plan. So therefore, you know, part of our local plan has already been written, has already been published. It sets obviously the strategic framework for London, but it also sets certain delivery targets which individual boroughs must aspire to. It also includes a suite of policies on matters like design, on heritage, etc., which we are required to follow. So when we write our local plan, we will start from the premise that the London Plan is already an integral part of our local plan, and how do we reflect that in local policy, and how do we ensure that the particular challenges, the local circumstances, local priorities are reflected in our own local plan. So the target of 2,157 will be likely to be recommended for acceptance as being the housing target for the borough. To do otherwise creates concern about how we would be able to present that evidence at examination. And as Nigel has just confirmed, the experience from other examinations in public across the capital have suggested failure to take that as a starting point. It would be extremely risky. And remember, our local plan must be in general conformity with the London Plan. So how does the London Plan say that housing supply targets are achieved? So it basically says that we have to allocate an appropriate range and number of sites that are suitable for residential and mixed-use development and intensification. That's a starting point. So if you recall, our existing adopted local plan includes a document which includes currently around 50 development sites around the borough, which were expected to deliver our housing delivery targets last time. I anticipate the local plan that we publish in the summer will probably include well in excess of 100 allocated sites. Obviously, that will be a draft proposal. A major part of that initial proposal's consultation will be to test whether or not those draft site allocations are truly deliverable. The London Plan also requires us to encourage development on what are called windfall sites. So this is the euphemism, if you like, for small sites. So these are sites which aren't formally allocated in the local plan. And we should also enable the delivery of housing capacity that is identified in opportunity areas. We have two opportunity areas in the borough. One is the old Oakham Park Royal Development Corporation, which of course is as Nigel has said, is a separate local planning authority and therefore has separate housing supply targets. Or put another way, it means that any housing delivery in, for example, the North Acton area doesn't count towards Ealing Local Planning Authority's local plan delivery target. We also have an opportunity area in Southall, and we are well on course to not just meeting but to exceeding the housing targets that were set in the London plan for the Southall opportunity area. The London plan then talks about making the best use of land. That's one of the key principles of good growth that's set out as one of the key objectives of the local plan. And what that's talking about is optimizing, therefore, in a housing context, the potential for housing delivery on suitable and available brownfield sites. It also says that we should, as part of the development management process, establish ambitious but achievable build-out rates at the planning stage. And so the London plan then goes on to describe the various potential sources of housing capacity, and these will probably come as no surprise to those of you who've served on the planning committee, because these are often cited as justifications for development in certain circumstances. So these will be areas with high existing or planned public transport accessibility, areas which are perhaps underutilized, such as car parks or low density out of town centre retail parks and supermarkets. And indeed, some of the draft site allocations that will come forward in the summer will include some of those sites as well. It also talks about intensification. This is a euphemism then for how can we use or make better use, sorry, of land which is in low density. It could be commercial, it could be leisure, it could be in other infrastructure uses. How can we also redevelop surplus utility and public sector owned sites, small sites, which I've already mentioned, and industrial sites in the context of co-location, intensification and substitution. And there's a raft of policies which we discussed at the last meeting, which explain how that might work in practice. But of course, that has to be considered within the context that there is an acute shortage of suitable employment land in the borough. And of course, land is a scarce commodity, as we keep saying. And housing is just one use that is competing for that use. So what will that mean then for Ealing? So in terms of where would good growth primarily then be concentrated? So the sorts of areas we would expect to see growth located would be obviously in our town centres, around areas of public transport accessibility, and obviously Crossrail has been a major catalyst for development in the borough. West London Orbital Railway, which is a major infrastructure project which the council has sponsored and is very, very keen, has been working jointly with a number of West London authorities, which is a new railway line that will extend from Hounslow up to Brent Cross, is certainly one scheme which could potentially therefore provide an impetus for higher density development. The regeneration of our estates, we have already successfully completed a programme of regeneration where planning applications have been conceived and considered, and master plans are being built out. So we're seeing that good work at places like Green Man Lane, on the old South Acton estate, etc. And we're now seeing some of the sort of category B estates that were identified in the early plans now also being brought forward. So we recently had a tenants vote on the High Lane estate, for example, and there are proposals for the regeneration of that estate. Mixed use intensification then of some of our locally strategic industrial sites, but noting the comments that I made before. Opportunity areas, what are called strategic areas of regeneration. So these are areas of acute deprivation of the borough, and we have a number of pockets of those, notably in places like Northolt, South Acton, the Copley Close estate and parts of Southall, and of course those very important site allocations I mentioned before. But any plan has got to reflect the different challenges, opportunities of each of the 7 towns that make up Ealing. So the strategy that we will present in the summer will outline this in a series of what we're calling town plans to show what the potential opportunities for growth and development will be, how they'll be managed, how that will reflect local circumstances, needs, and priorities. And I think it's also just worth making the point that not all the change will necessarily be transformative. In many places, as we are seeing already up and down the borough, we will see incremental growth through a process of suburban intensification. A lot of that actually driven by permitted development rights, which actually means the planning process has effectively, as a result of government policy, not been able to control development, possibly in the way that we would like, particularly in relation to design. And that will obviously be on smaller, unallocated sites that aren't defined in the local plan. So I'll pause there if there are any questions.
Yeah, sorry, I muted myself. Thanks there, Steve. Are there any questions for Steve? Okay, I can't see any.
I think Gareth and
Councillor.
Yes, I have my hand up, and so does Councillor Burke as well after me.
Okay, go ahead. So, okay, we'll take Councillor Shaw and then Councillor Burke.
Yes, thanks, Chair. Steve, thanks very much. Very detailed as usual, and a good tour around. I was interested particularly in the smaller, the small sites that are identified, and how this, how realistic you think this is in actually helping achieve the targets, because obviously these are things that might not necessarily come up. How many sites does the authority have that they've identified as small sites where you're only perhaps going to get 1 or 2 units at best, type thing, and whether these come up in a more piecemeal way? Is it to do with perhaps a house sale or development and so on that actually leads to the sort of suburban intensification that you identified in your last slide, where a large house gets converted into 2 or 4 flats on occasions?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I mean, clearly, obviously, I think this is about the balance and proportionality. So clearly, obviously, in the local plan, we are obviously required to allocate sites. We tend to take as our threshold in terms of size a 1/4 of a hectare. We do occasionally include sites which are smaller than that, where they are of perhaps strategic import. It might be within a town centre, for example, where development, particularly in relation to an associated infrastructure project, might be able to unlock the potential of a bigger site. So we'll end up with probably somewhere in the range of 100, 125 sites in the local plan, significantly up from the, I think it's 49 in the adopted plan. I'm always very hesitant to define small sites, smaller than that, in the local plan. Because I think there is a resourcing issue about how do you actually encompass that within a local development plan, because clearly, obviously, the more granular you are, the bigger the document, and the more difficult it is to then do the various tests that we will be required to do around appropriateness, suitability, deliverability, etc. And I think we must remember that it's the bigger sites that make the biggest contribution towards our housing delivery. Now, the GLA in production of the London plan wanted to have a greater focus on some of these smaller sites. And this was a real debate in the London plan examination, because the historical record of boroughs like Ealing, and this wasn't unique to Ealing, it was reflected across West London and indeed other parts of suburban London as well, is that the contribution of windfall sites, as we call, in other words, on sites which aren't allocated, traditionally was around the sort of 300, 350 units per annum. And whilst we understood the need to obviously look wider, to cast the net further, and that suburban intensification offered scope and opportunities, I think there was concern about how you would actually plan for that in practice, but also real misgivings about the methodology that the mayor was proposing in terms of what the potential contribution to supply was. And indeed, a view, particularly in boroughs like Ealing, that in fact, a lot of the low-hanging fruit had actually already been taken, but also some nervousness to possibly promote and accelerate beyond what we would deem to be acceptable margins, because very often, planning committee members will know this very well. It's very often those very small infield or backland development sites which cause the greatest consternation and controversy. And so I think they are best dealt with through criteria-based policies, which will sit elsewhere in the plan, and are best dealt with on an individual case-by-case basis to set design parameters in advance for those very, very small granular sites in a local plan. I think, apart from making my job virtually impossible, would perhaps be a little bit too top down and heavy-handed would be my judgment. I do have other members of my team also waiting the wings, so they might want to chip in at some point as well. But I think I'll stop there. But perhaps take Linda's question if that's given you enough for now, Gareth.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you, Steve. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Councillor Burke.
It's really just a question of balance, really. So how we deal with all the other meetings we've had have talked a lot about quality, about design, and then all of this is about intensification, and how we get that balance in a local plan so that a planning committee can really give equal weight to those two issues. I don't think this is a straightforward answer, Steve. I'm sure if you could answer this, you'd be a millionaire by now, but I really just wonder how you advise a planning committee around getting the balance between those two things. And the second question is really that whole thing about this town centre thing and identifying sites, and a worry I've heard from other councillors that what that does is really focuses housing in certain areas and actually leads to neglect in others. And the one that often gets mentioned is Northolt, by the councillors there, and how we really make sure that we use our local plan to develop areas in a really positive way, and not just, to be blunt, where the developers want to go for the easy wins with the transport hubs. I hope those questions make sense.
They certainly do, and they're really, really good questions, and have is a theme which I have picked up at previous LDAP meetings. From a professional planner perspective, I think the obsession we've had with housing targets and housing numbers, I think, has been to the detriment of place shaping and to the image of the profession generally, and of course has really made the job of planning committee members so much harder. I think members who sit on planning committee are unsung heroes. They have one of the most difficult, arduous jobs on the council. But this obsession with the target, with housing need, and I'm not in any way seeking to suggest that providing more genuinely affordable housing is not a clear top priority for the council and will be a key objective in the local plan. But the local plan is about commerce, it is about infrastructure, it is about climate action and a whole raft of other measures. So, and you put your finger on it in your opening statement there, which was about design. Too often, in our obsession to meet these mythical targets, which do change, there is the concern, and I hear this from some sections of the community, that we sacrifice the quality of the housing in trying to meet those targets, and we also fail to see how that housing, that development, fits into our broader place shaping ambitions. So I'm really hoping that when we go out to the consultation on the local plan in the summer, that we can really press a bit of a reset button in terms of that and be clear. Having said that, the target that has been set for us in the London plan remains, and I'm on record of saying this many places before, and I've even had these words quoted back at me, so I'll say them again, remains very ambitious, very, very challenging, particularly given the fact that they effectively started from 2019-20, so we were already 2 years into the sort of 10-year cycle, and because of COVID, we're already playing catch up in relation to that housing supply target. I have to say, though, whilst that remains ambitious and challenging, compared to some of the figures that Nigel was quoting in terms of the government's housing need methodology, and if we were chasing that pipe dream of something in excess of 3,000 units per annum, or the original figure in the London plan, which was close to 3,000, around 2,800 or more, quite frankly, they would have been undeliverable. I do get quite cross as a planner, and again, I've said this before, that the yardstick, the measure that is used to test the performance of local planning authorities is the housing delivery test. Now, unless I send my team out on bricklaying courses and carpentry courses, quite frankly, there's not very much they can do in terms of actually constructing and building houses. If actually the measure that was used to judge our performance as a local planning authority was the number of planning permissions and approvals, quite clearly, it's a very, very different picture. And of course, there is this disconnect between the fact that not all of those approvals, not all of those planning permissions translate into actual completions. There's a big mismatch, and that will vary over time. Again, they're a little bit out of date, but the last two major reports on barriers to housing delivery that were commissioned by the Mayor of London, I think the consultant was Moliere off the top of my head. The first report said something like 50%. I think the second report was something like a third. I can't remember the exact figures, but between half and a third of all planning permissions were obtained by developers who had a track record of building no homes whatsoever. They were basically speculators. They were ratcheting up the value of the land, selling on the land with the planning approval, and of course saddling the new owners with the additional problems around viability and making deliverability so much more difficult. And on the point around town centres, I think, again, you hit upon a really important point. The adopted local plan actually specifies, and this was the view of the council at the time, that there were certain geographies in the borough where there would be no growth at all. Northolt was one of them. There wasn't a single site allocation mentioned for that corner of the borough. Similarly for Perryvale, and I think for Hanwell, I think we had three off the top of my head, of which one was a major development site of some substances now being built out. But we said generally that those parts of the borough would not be areas where we would expect to see growth. I think the strategy that I was outlining on my slide there about future spatial development plans was suggesting that actually all parts of the borough are going to have to do some heavy lifting to some extent or not, but also therefore would be able to share in some of the benefits and prosperity that brings. When I speak to Northolt councils, they often complain about the lack of Section 106 proceeds and planning obligation money that filters down to them because there is no real development. Equally, though, I have to say, in other parts of the borough where there's lots of development, they say, well, actually, the Section 106 money is not delivering on some of the promised infrastructure fast enough. So, there are two ends of that argument, if you like.
Steve, I don't want to digress too much in this, but I've recently come back from a trip to Oslo, and what they've done there in terms of using housing, not even 106 monies, just using housing in areas like Northolt to regenerate those areas in terms of the green spaces and what have you, and playgrounds that go with it. I mean, if anyone's got time in their very busy days, it was really, really interesting in terms of how they've done that. And actually, they're not that different in size to us, really, actually, because it's a quite small city. But I just think there's some international lessons that we really should be trying to find in your busy teams, that we could actually use quite helpfully to think about that quality and regeneration aspect to this.
Are you suggesting a site visit to Oslo? Because after the horrible 2 years we've had where we've not been able to go anywhere, would sounds absolutely delightful. Although I'm not quite sure my humble local government officer salary will probably extend to too many rounds in the pubs and bars of Oslo. Because I remember it was very, very horrendously expensive. But yeah, point taken.
Yeah.
Steve, you are invited to Northolt, though.
Oh, I love Northolt. It's just up the road from me, so more than happy.
Okay, well, I think the beer is much cheaper in Northolt than in Oslo, so that is one thing to be said in its favour. Okay, well, in the absence of any further questions to Steve at this point, then let's go over to last but not least to Dave Baptiste, who Dave is going to tell us a bit about first homes. So over to you, Dave.
Okay. Can you see me? Can you hear me?
I can see you and hear you. Yeah.
I still got your name on my screen, so let's see how this works out. I'm just to introduce myself. I'm Dave Baptiste, the head of housing development in Ealing, and amongst other things, I'm involved in advising, supporting, negotiating affordable housing and delivering affordable housing in the borough. So through the planning system, I have quite a lot of contact with developers and the like to try and deliver affordable housing. So I'll try and build on both Steve's and Nigel's comments about first homes, but the detail will be first homes. I'll try and get the presentation up if I can. Seems to be eluding me at the moment. It doesn't seem to be working. Excuse me, bear with me for the time being. Sorry about this. The presentation seems to have disappeared. I'll try again. Nope. For some reason, it won't allow me to share my presentation, I'm afraid. And all I can see on my screen is Councillor Paul Conlon's heading.
Yes, that's what I can see as well. I'm not sure why that is. As far as I can tell, it's not because of anything that I'm doing. I can see your presentation now, so
Right.
maybe things are okay now. Yeah, certainly I can see the front page of your presentation, Dave.
Okay, let's see. Can you see it now?
Yes, I can still see it. Yeah.
I think, David, I may be sharing this for you.
Oh, yes,
Yep.
it says it's
Yep.
Steve Barton's screen. Yeah.
Oh, is that you, Steve? All right.
It's me. Sorry, because you were having problems there. So I'll start you on your first slide.
All right, great. Very helpful. Is that
Can you see that?
through?
Can you see that?
No, I can just see your name, Steve, at the moment.
Oh.
Oh.
Can members of the committee see the first slide, which says overview?
Yes, yeah, I can see it.
All right,
Yes,
I can
I've
see
got
it.
it, Steve. So
I
Okay.
can see it now.
Okay.
Could you run the slide pack?
Yeah, I'll try to. There we go.
Okay.
So David, if you just refer to your slides and just tell me when to move them on for you.
Okay.
You're on overview at the moment.
Right. It's got a bit of an odd view on my screen for some reason. So I'll have to enlarge it. And I can only see some of it. It seems to be showing two slides at the same time. Is that all right? Or is it just one on yours?
I've just got the slideshow.
Okay.
Do you
Right.
just want to talk? Just want to talk to it?
Yeah, I'll talk to it now. Apologies for that. This has been mentioned previously, just briefly in Nigel's presentation. First Homes is First Homes is a new government affordable housing product that they are wishing for local authorities, local planning authorities to consider. Just to talk about the envelope of that scheme, it's a, excuse me for using the word product, but this is a kind of common language that we use in terms of opportunity that people have to live in such affordable homes. So First Homes is a product that is offered to people who essentially live and work in the borough and can afford that product. It's capped at, I think as mentioned earlier, at incomes no greater than £90,000, and the home can be purchased in London at a maximum. This is a capped, the discounted rate of £420,000, and that home would be discounted to at least 30% of the market. So it's a discount market sale product, which is already out there, just rarely seen. But this is something that the government wishes us to consider, and it's effectively, in terms of the affordable housing envelope that's negotiated, it's top slicing the first 25%, addressing that had to be addressed as a First Homes accommodation. So immediately there are some tensions with how and what else is delivered, and I think I'll come on just sort of the housing needs side as we canter through. So can you move to the next slide, Steve? So eligibility, I've partly covered that. I'll move swiftly through any areas so we can hone in on some of the meatier aspects of this. Eligibility in broad terms are based on people earning no more than £90,000, the same as other intermediate products like shared ownership, where there's a £90,000 income cap. And of course, you have to have be able to generate a mortgage to afford the discounted purchase price. And of course, there is a link with on the local level, that eligibility criteria can be enhanced or augmented particularly if there is a particular view of key workers in an area. You can give weight to that. Can you move on to the next slide, Steve? Thanks. So here's some detail. This is actually based on a typical one bed in Northolt, fairly recent figures, just to give an illustration of how First Homes might work. You can see on the sort of bottom of that table the relative incomes that would be required to purchase a one bed home in Northolt, starting with shared ownership, having an income of £40,000, assuming a 40% equity share. First Homes, slightly higher income, £45,000, assuming a 30% discount, and then the comparison between London living rent, London affordable rent, and social rent. Now, I suppose the point to note here is the majority of the housing need this is a sort of tourism, nothing particularly new here, is required in the borough currently, is weighted towards social rent. And that's no particular surprise. So it's really comparing what do we get for first homes versus what do we need in terms of affordable rent, social rent. If you can move on to the next slide, Steve. So deliverability of affordable renting. Again, is a breakdown, sort of an illustration of how first homes looks in Northolt and Greenford areas, an illustration, and some figures which talk to what the level of that subsidy, that discount would have to be applied in order to make those homes affordable in that definition of at least 30% discount to the market. And I guess the point to note here is that discount is actually a discount that's contained within the scheme. There's no separate pot of grant available. That those discounts are applied, if you like, by the developer, and it's a scheme cost, so it's going to put pressure on everything else that's going to be delivered in that scheme. Shall we move on then, Steve? So as local planning authority, and this is more Steve's area than mine, we're expected to prioritise social rent, as I said earlier, and the minimum of 25% first homes should be applied in the affordable mix, which actually, like I said earlier, puts a bit of pressure on the remaining of the affordable mix that's delivered. I'll pick out a figure here. Only 32% of affordable homes built in Ealing over the past 3 years were delivered by developer contributions. So that means with no grant, it's a much lower proportion. You can see from here, 68%, the majority of homes, of affordable homes of all tenures, are delivered with grant, with GLA funding. So that's quite a significant, and it probably talks to some of the figures that we'll look at later. Quite a significant point to make. Most of the affordable homes are delivered with grant, either because the whole scheme is 100% affordable, or the GLA have been able to apply funding, which they won't do going forward, to Section 106 to deliver affordable housing. And there is important mention of Help to Buy, which is a scheme you may well be familiar with, which also offers a discount to the market. It's a subsidised scheme by government, effectively, to developers, and that will end in April 23. And there's a kind of a direct comparison in the market. It's Help to Buy is extremely popular with buyers and developers alike, because there's effectively an interest-free loan that doesn't have to be repaid, and then initially is repaid after a 5-year period on quite a small interest rate. And that key figure at the bottom, Savills estimate 41% of Help to Buy purchasers couldn't afford to buy without the assistance of an equity loan. So next slide, Steve. These are just some headline figures. I won't dwell on too much, but they give an indication of the kind of delivery over the past few years. It may if you look on the column a little below halfway down, it says 217 homes. That alludes to the 38% I talked about earlier, where that, in broad terms, is the number of homes that are being delivered by developers not using grant, as opposed to the figure above that, 611 of affordable homes being delivered with grant. So again, you can see that kind of stark contrast. And then there is a simple estimation of if that delivery of the 217 homes, 25% of those being 54, if they were delivered as first homes, then you get 54 homes, which represents 8% of affordable delivery overall. So even given this is the current situation, if this were applied, they are relatively small numbers that we're talking about for first homes, and weigh that against the kind of affordable housing product that we are more inclined to need, which is social rent, where we need much larger figures. Next slide, Steve. So some of this is more talking about the GLA's local plan position, which of course has credible weight when our own local plan is developed, as Steve has mentioned, and that gives a breakdown of how the London plan would apportion those affordable tenures. And then we'll see in probably the next slide, I think, how that might be compared to first homes if that were imposed. First homes is an intermediate product, but if it would effectively top slice some of the affordable, and then after first homes delivered, you would get a policy weight applied to the affordable homes delivered after that. If you can get to the next slide, Steve. This is talking about the practice note from the GLA, pretty much like the previous slide, but we have to kind of balance the delivery of tenure against strategic targets, and first homes has to be considered at a local level, and which it will be in the local plan. And again, it repeats the cap. Can you move on, Steve? Right, I think this slide slightly changed. This really should be issues for all housing associations and effectively the council. So it's to sum up really that those developer contributions, which we rely on to help to deliver affordable housing, and the Section 106, there is a discussion, I suppose, to be had about where that subsidy should be applied. Should it be applied more to social rent or to making products more affordable on an intermediate level in schemes such as first homes? And there's a kind of direct competition between housing associations and developers in this respect, because if you like, the greater the amount of market sale homes, the more cross subsidy there can be for affordable. But on top of that, with the reduction or the withdrawal of grant funding for Section 106 schemes, it actually makes this a much starker situation, whereby a scheme, if it's not going to be funded with grants to deliver the affordable, then that scheme bears extra weight to try and, in terms of viability, to try and make that work. And if first homes is the first swipe of the affordable cut, you could see it would leave less for anything else. And it may be what developers want, but it probably wouldn't meet our strategic needs. But the other side to that is with the demise of Help to Buy, first homes may well be more popular with people in the community. who are seeking to enter home ownership. But that we don't expect first homes to deliver anywhere near the numbers that would be delivered in Help to Buy. So that kind of puts that in context. Can you move on? I think that might be the end of the slides. It is. Sorry, it's a bit disjointed, but my screen just wasn't showing me what I was speaking to, so I'm squinting at the screen. But I'll end there and take any questions.
Okay, thanks, thanks, Dave. I wonder if you've had a chance to have a look at the chat, and if you've seen the question that Councillor Ball left in there. He's actually left the meeting, but he put a question in chat.
Yeah.
Shall I read his question out, if I can?
I think I recall it, but by all means, if you can find it and read that out. I think he was saying it's first homes is not genuinely affordable.
He was saying that they're not genuinely affordable. Okay, well, I'll read it out now. Clearly, first homes aren't genuinely affordable. He said unaffordable, but he meant affordable. So I'm not advocating them, but I don't understand why there would be only 15 to 46 first homes according to Savills, versus the government expectation that there would be 25% of affordable housing units. Does this mean we can ignore the government on this? Well, I think the answer to the last bit is probably no. But anyway, Dave, perhaps you could have a go answering that. Is that question clear?
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, well, I agree. I don't think any of us can ignore government in that respect. And the other point is easy to agree. It's not genuinely affordable housing, either by our definition or the GLA's definition. But nevertheless, it may well have a place. I think those numbers, those low numbers, refer to the point that I've been trying to make, that the affordable housing is delivered through the planning system, purely through the planning system without grant, are much lower in numbers than the homes that were delivered with grant. So those numbers are based on an estimate of homes that would be delivered in the planning system, assuming there's no additional subsidy. So
okay.
They are fewer.
Those Savills figures are estimates of how much would actually be delivered. Is that correct?
Yeah, sort of higher and lower estimates. Yeah.
Which obviously is a lot less than 25% of total affordable housing delivery, unless we're not delivering very much affordable housing. So,
well, I think it's the contrary, really. If most affordable housing is delivered with grant and on schemes where, for instance, it would be 100% affordable, then as a proportion of all the affordable that's delivered, first homes wouldn't make as big a dent as we initially thought. So it's not 25% of that total, it's 25% of a much smaller figure that we're talking about. Don't know if that makes sense.
Yes, I think that makes sense to me. Are there any questions from members of the committee? Just specifically to Dave? I mean, if there's not, then we'll move on to more general questions. Okay, I can't see anyone indicating they have a question. So,
Chair, I do. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Councillor Martin. Okay.
I couldn't remember where my hand was.
Question then. Yeah, sorry, I was looking again. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just wondering about other types of housing, and if we're going to cover that in the plan. So traveller sites was mentioned in the documents we received, for example. And I was just wondering about also, there's people I think that live on canal barges in the borough as well. And should we be including them in this? Some question.
Okay, well, are you asking specifically about first homes here?
No, I thought you'd opened
this
up
is
to
just
general
a general
question.
Okay, so
Sorry, I meant to put my camera on as well.
okay, so that's a general question really to everyone, I think. If you could just note that, and we'll take a couple of more questions, and then give all three of the all three of the presenters a chance to answer them. So, okay, if people have noted that question from Councillor Martin, what about travellers and all of these other types of people demanding, with the demand for homes? Are there any other questions? So does anyone want to indicate with their virtual hand or their real hand? I'm sort of trying to flip between the two. There must be a few questions that people have got. Okay. Well, I'll ask one of my own then, just to keep things moving. One question that crops up a lot at the planning committee when we approve various schemes. People always say, "Are we building enough what they call family-sized homes?" By which, I think invariably they mean 3-bed and larger homes. And it's a very common question. Now, the targets specify the number of units. They don't say anything about, what size those units should be. So the criticism is that we're meeting the targets by building lots of small flats, and we're not building enough bigger units. So my question is, looking at the data, what evidence do we have for demand for different sizes of units, as opposed to just the number of units? And, is it true that maybe we should be building more 3-bed and more units, but we're not currently doing so? So, okay, I'll throw that back to the panel. But that question and also Councillor Martin's question, and I think I'll take the answers in the order in which the people spoke. So, Nigel, I don't know if you want to have a go at answering or just giving your thoughts on either or both of those questions. Perhaps you might know a bit about the demand for different sizes of units.
Yeah, in terms of the different sizes of units, typically we've been finding a significant need for larger units. So it is quite possible that what you would label family homes are required. There is a really technical explanation to this that I don't want to dig too deep into. But if you go back to my presentation, I said that the GLA found the need to be 66,000 per annum in London. But that was on the assumption that any single person who wanted their own property and was aged over 25 had their own property. So they were seeking to move people out of family homes, and that generated an enormous need for small dwellings because they were giving everyone within their model a need for a small property. Whereas we tend to model on the types of households likely to exist in an area, and that tends to generate a much larger need for larger properties. So in those terms, we're likely to have a draft report within about a month of now. So I wouldn't like to commit that it definitely will be the case or not, but it's quite likely. And for other areas that we've done, it's certainly generated a significant need for larger numbers. In terms of travellers and boat dwellers, we've actually done the Gypsy and Traveller assessment for Ealing as part of the West London SHMA. Right at the moment, the GLA are commissioning a London-wide Gypsy and Traveller accommodation assessment. That's under procurement at the moment. That looks at Gypsy and Travellers, doesn't look at boat dwellers though. So boat dwellers do tend to sit completely separately from travellers within the policy. But in general, most councils have a policy relating to both groups within their local plan. But your planning officers will have a much better idea about that.
Chair, shall I come in next?
Yeah. Sorry, I muted myself again. Yes, over to you now, Steve.
Yeah, just to make a couple of points then, just reflecting on some of the points been raised by colleagues. I mean, firstly, just to say, I think that's why it's really important that when we talk about affordable housing, and particularly when we talk about what is understood to be generally affordable housing, of course, there is no such thing as defined in the London plan, but we all understand that to mean products which are generally affordable to a larger proportion of the local population. I think that raises the dilemma that to focus a policy that only looks at products, as the government has done in relation to first or starter homes, and as the council have perhaps done in the past in terms of looking at particular product types, is just to remember that products do change over time. And so actually the key relationship, and that's what Nigel will be doing when he crunches the numbers for us, and some of the data that David was referring to attempts to show and explain, is actually the relationship between people's income and the cost of various housing products, either to buy or to rent in given geographies. So that's perhaps illustrated neatly by the concept of discount market rent, which members of the planning committee will have heard about very often. Reports are presented to them. 20% discount market rent in Ealing will probably not generate a genuinely affordable product in that geography, but it may well do in perhaps North or parts of Southall. It depends what the level of discount is and where the development is proposed. And on that basis, I think what Dave was attempting to say, and I think Nigel was evidencing this earlier as well, but I don't want to put words in his mouth. He might want to put this in his own words, that we don't believe that first homes is a genuinely affordable housing product, and therefore shouldn't be a key part of the mix. In relation to Gypsies and Travellers, I mean, this is going to be a real issue for us. We do have a Gypsy and Traveller site in the borough, although we do know that this site needs quite extensive investment to bring it up to standard. It's also, I would contend, in the wrong place, because it is next to North Circular Road. It is in the middle of an industrial estate, and so therefore it is not, I would argue, perhaps the most suitable location for a residential community. And so the council will be faced with the dilemma of having to invest quite substantially in bringing that site up to scratch, even if you accept it is in the right place, or to look for alternative locations. In relation to the question about moorings, and that's a very unusual, very interesting question. Most moorings, of course, are typically classed as being for visitors, but so they therefore don't count officially as residential units. That's the reason why I say that. In reality, of course, we do know that most are probably occupied as permanent dwellings, but that in terms of planning, they would therefore be viewed. I've just lost my London plan, it just disappeared off my iPad. So they will be covered by policy H2 on small sites, which talks about supporting those wishing to bring forward custom, self-build and community-led housing. So it wouldn't be part of the matrices that Nigel's team will be working on as part of the SHMA directly. Back to you, Chair.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Okay, Dave, your responses to those questions, please.
If I can just pick up without dwelling on it, I think the point about are there enough family homes being built in the borough, and the short answer is no. It's always playing catch up. to try and deliver against a very, very large need. The obvious point is in the purely market sector, there was very few family homes delivered, largely 1 and 2, and the obvious point about it being profit motive that generates those 1 and 2s. And in the more affordable social housing sector, the honest answer is there's probably not enough, but there's a tension between the space that you have and the homes that you're able to deliver within that space, and the targets or the number of homes you're trying to deliver, and the amenity space, that the crucial amenity space that goes with delivering 3 beds and above. I think there is a reasonable proportion of 3 beds, particularly on regeneration schemes and beyond, but mainly on regeneration schemes. But that falls off rather dramatically in sort of standalone sites, and of course affordability comes into that in terms of the scheme's affordability. So sometimes it is a trade-off between how many homes and what types of homes, but that's a tension that we have to live with and push as hard as we can to get more family homes. There were very few 4-bedroom plus homes, and that's even more a feature of the tension between the numbers and the homes and the amenity space. But again, that's a challenge that's there for all of us. I can leave it there at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Okay, well, we've got time for a few more questions, so hopefully there are some councillors who have got something to say. So I can see Councillor Shaw. So does anyone else have a question before I ask Councillor Shaw to speak? I'm sure. Okay.
Yeah, so just, a very...
Okay, well, Councillor Shaw, go ahead and ask your question. I'll give, and can other councillors can have a chance to think of what they'd like to ask about or just contribute, because this is your chance to say something. So don't miss it. Okay, go ahead, Councillor Shaw.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Obviously we're looking at the need. We know there's been a chronic shortage of housing supply over the years, as Dave has just sort of mentioned, that not enough homes have been built. Obviously it's largely out of authorities' hands to the building of homes, and especially affordable homes. So it's there are controls beyond what the local authority can do. So realistically, and perhaps being a bit cynical here and playing sort of devil's advocate, I'd throw it out to sort of Nigel, Steve and Dave, that of the 21,500 units that are in the target of the London plan, how many of those do you think will be completed and built in 10 years' time? And if it's below that, clearly, it's not keeping up, with what we know the demand is. And so what further do you think there is we could do within the framework we've got, and the planning policies to actually make sure that we can deliver that, or even exceed it if possible?
Okay, thanks, Councillor Shaw. Okay, well, I'll just take the panel in the same order as before then. So, Nigel, do you?
In terms of actually delivering within Ealing, I'm not obviously as familiar as Steve would be, so I probably haven't got that much to contribute as to how much of this actually will be delivered. To come back to an earlier point, though, in terms of target-led planning policy, your policy is dominated by that number, that you should deliver 21,000 dwellings in 10 years. And there is this danger, to come back to the previous point we just raised, that if you're on a site and you're offered 3 1-bedroom flats or 1 3-bedroom flats, they probably accommodate exactly the same people. And if anything, the 3-bedroom flat maybe has the potential to accommodate more people, because it could accommodate 1 larger family rather than 3 single persons. However, from a statistics point of view and meeting your targets point of view, there's the pressure to take the 3 1-bedroom flats, because you're delivering 3 homes, not 1. And that is the real danger of the target-led approach, that you're just saying we need to hit this one number above anything else. You miss the bigger story. But in terms of how many of these are going to happen, obviously Steve is going to know this just so much better than me, so I can't comment.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thanks, Nigel. Over to you then, Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I mean, Nigel's made a really, really important point there. And, again, this is where, targets are never really truly smart. They will always have unintended consequences. And we see this in other aspects of the London plan and in particular national planning policy as well. First and starter homes was designed to be a generally affordable housing product. And we've just learned very, very clearly it isn't for the majority of people, particularly in a London and an Ealing context. So there's a mismatch there. But to take a slightly unorthodox approach to answering the question, if our target then is roughly 20,000, it's a bit more than that. Of course, the planning policy in the London plan and the existing adopted planning policy in Ealing is that 50% of all new homes should be affordable. That's not generally affordable, that's affordable in the wider definition, not necessarily the definition that we were talking about earlier, which has a link to particular incomes. I should just stress, of course, that target is based on major developments, so it's developments above 10 units. So units below 10 units, there's absolutely no requirement whatsoever to provide any affordable housing. And I know that colleagues, members of the planning committee, are often very frustrated when they see schemes which are 9 units, even though the site could possibly support more units. But the developer clearly then has a disincentive to provide more units, because they will know that they will then have to provide a proportion of affordable units or provide a commuted sum. So that will obviously affect the viability of the project, and ultimately their profit margins. We were hoping, as part of our local plan making process, to bring forward planning policy proposals that would seek to close that gap and actually insist on some measure of affordable housing provision and indeed contribution towards infrastructure on smaller sites. But unfortunately, as a result of government policy, national government policy, that has proven to be more and more difficult. And inspectors are striking those policies out at examination. Indeed, the mayor valiantly tried to do so as part of the London plan. And in the examination, I'm afraid, those attempts at writing in that policy were struck out by the inspector. So when you're looking at the overall target, you are obviously looking at a target which encompasses smaller sites as well. And those smaller sites will not likely generate any affordable housing at all. So you're straight away playing catch up in terms of your 50%. And I suppose the next point to make is, of course, the mayor has then said at levels of 35%, in most cases, there are exceptions, particularly like public sector land and so forth, where it would be still 50%, that developers would therefore be immune from having to undertake the comprehensive viability assessments that would normally be required. And so therefore, there is no way of assessing in detail, if they offer 35%, whether or not the site might be able to support in viability terms a higher proportion of affordable products, whatever they may be. So again, perhaps it's no surprise at Planning Committee that most private schemes will come in at exactly 35%, because they then get the pass to not have to go through the full viability process. So all of that, I suppose, is suggesting that we are going to struggle to get anything like half of that supply through affordable products, however you define that.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Dave.
I'll just come in briefly. I mean, in a sense, I'm talking weirdly from not from the perspective of housing as being a great thing, which I think it is, but it's quite a scary number if you talk to the wider community and they hear a figure of 21,000, even if it's over a 10-year period. You know, you can imagine the resistance to that, even if you demonstrate there's a real need for the kind of housing. But in terms of how would they be delivered, well, a lot of it depends on sites, and you know, they will get more difficult as time goes on. A lot depends on the market conditions, and when you're down in doldrums, in times of recession, of which there will always be a period of that, the only thing that keeps affordable housing going is grant and subsidy. So it really depends on how much of that is available over the course of time. So there's no categoric answer to how much of that 21,000 will be delivered, except that, going back to Nigel's point, we're all kind of driven by targets. But I think the nuance of that is, you know, can we do a good job within those targets? Can we meet you know, a wide range of needs and family sizes and accommodation, and not just go for the numbers? And the place is really important in that respect.
Okay, thanks, Dave. Okay, I'm just looking out for hands. Does anyone want to ask a last sort of question? Or has everyone's question been answered? So if you do have a question, please speak up or wave or whatever. Okay, if not, then I'll draw the meeting to a close. So you know, thanks very much to all of the speakers. So thanks Nigel for sort of coming along as our sort of guest speaker, and thanks to Steve and Dave for their contributions. The next meeting, which is the final meeting in the current round for this municipal year, is on the 22nd March. If I don't know if Steve, perhaps you could remind us of what the subject is. I think it was around sort of health and activity and things like that, wasn't it? Did we call it? I can't remember what was the title we gave it, but
it's going to be very much focusing on the theme of the 20-minute neighbourhood.
The 20-minute neighbourhood. Okay, so that's something we'll find out about at the next meeting. So okay, I'll hopefully see most of you at the on the 22nd of March. And once again, thanks for everyone for attending, and I'll see you then.